Hello everyone and welcome to my childhood bedroom. So since I'm home this week, I thought it would be kind of fun to go over some of the books that meant a lot to me as a kid, just because I have them all here in my room, and just share with you what they meant to me and a little bit about what they're about and kind of the time period in which I read them. All of the books that I'm going to mention, they're not all actually going to be children's books. I read a wide array of books growing up. So I read children's, young adult, and then adult. And I kind of just wanted to share with you. I'm sure a lot of you will also be able to relate to some of the books that I'm going to be talking about, but then also some of the books I'm going to mention probably you've never heard of. So without further ado, let's just get started. So this is going to be really hard for me to choose which books to talk about, just because every single book on my shelf means a lot to me and everyone has a story behind it. But I really just wanted to focus on the books that really mean a lot, and I'm just gonna go in order. So the first book I want to mention, this is my copy of Anne Frank's diary, which I actually read when I was a little girl, but I was probably like late elementary school, early middle school. I read this book twice, I think 2 years in a row, and then I haven't picked it up since. And obviously this is a book that I do want to reread at some point. The reason why this copy means a lot to me is obviously that it has a picture of Anne Frank on it, and I just remember when I was little, I always would stare at this photo of this girl and just have so much empathy for her, just because she was obviously similar to my age. She actually might have been a little bit older in this picture than when I read it, but I just think it was just so crazy to know what ended up happening to her and how young she was. And I just remember this copy is just very special to me, and this book is definitely something that I want to reread in the future. So the next book that I'm going to mention is Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. And the reason why I want to mention this book is because this is actually from my first grade classroom. If you can see, it has my teacher's name on it, and O, I think, is the reading level. But the reason why I wanted to bring this book up is because first grade is obviously one of the big grades where you learn not learn how to read, but you learn how to accelerate your reading and read more challenging things. And this is probably one of the first chapter books that I've ever read, and I thought at the time that the text was really small, and I feel like it still is pretty small considering that I read this in first grade. But yeah, I just remember this being one of the first chapter books that I read. I think I was a little bit ahead in reading when I was little. I could be wrong, but that's why this book always makes me think of when I first started learning how to read. So I'm really just going to be switching around in timelines with these books, but when I was 16 years old, I for some reason had the idea to start a daily journal where you journal one entry every single day. So I was researching different types of journals, and I ended up finding this journal here, which is the Happiness Project journal, and it had an accompanying book to it, which is the Happiness Project. And this was the first self-help book that I ever read, which obviously catapulted my interest into self-help and then later into spirituality. So I remember reading this book and I liked it, but I didn't love it. I felt like this is an adult book, and I think that I just was a little too young at the time to read this book, but I was still really interested in self-help. So one day I decided to go to Barnes & Noble, and I was walking through the self-help section and I stumbled upon Gabrielle Bernstein. So this actually isn't the book that I stumbled upon. I stumbled upon her first book, which is called Add More Ink to Your Life, which I'll actually put a picture up right here because this cover really captivated me, because it was just someone who was a little bit younger, who was giving spiritual tools and advice, and it just really piqued my interest. And it kind of just catapulted me into this whole exploration of spirituality and self-help, and has really shaped the person that I am today. And also Gabby Bernstein is one of my someone who I aspire to be, and is the reason why I also want to become a motivational speaker later in life. And so even though the Happiness Project, which funnily enough didn't really impact my life, it did lead me in the right direction to find a spiritual teacher and just opened me up to a whole new genre of reading. Not only did the Happiness Project do that, but the journal that I kept for 5 years, which that one was mainly in high school, I actually still journal every single day. This is my 9th year. I obviously had to get a different journal because that one ran out of space. But yeah, that's also something that has stuck with me from that book. It made a huge impact on me in a very like indirect way. I feel like I can't be talking about my favorite childhood books without talking about a Dr. Seuss book. So I'm not going to be mentioning The Cat in the Hat or anything like that. I'm going to talk about the Dr. Seuss book that was on my shelf, and I think it's the only one that was on my shelf as a little kid, but that is The King, the Mice, and the Cheese. I just really like this book. It's just, I don't know if people know this Dr. Seuss book a lot, but I really like this book because it has like a lot of Middle Eastern influences. That's kind of what I got from it, and I just thought it was like a really funny story, and yeah, I just thought I had to mention the Dr. Seuss book that was on my shelf. So the next books that I want to mention are books that I read in like 4th or 5th grade, and whenever people would ask me the question of like what book got you into reading, this is one of the first books that comes to mind, and it's called The Doll People by Anne M. Martin and Laura Godwin. And this was, again, like obviously like a pretty thick book for the age, for how old I was at the time, and this book is all about like dolls coming alive at night, like kind of like Toy Story. And obviously since I was a little girl and I loved playing with dolls and toys, I loved books and TV shows or movies that kind of had that theme in it. And I really love this book because not only is it an actual chapter book with like with like smaller text, but it also has like really beautiful like pictures in it as well. And I just remember loving these books so much, and because I love these books so much, I obviously read the sequel of it, which is The Meanest Doll in the World, which is the second book. I actually think there is a third book, which I must have gotten from the library, which is why I don't have it. But yeah, these are again like when I started getting into bigger and bigger books and more books that kind of resembled adult but obviously had child themes, and these books just mean a lot to me. These are also books that I would want to reread and see kind of how my opinion has changed. But the thing about like rereading childhood books or rewatching books or movies that you watch as a kid as an adult is that your perspective is just going to change, because when you're an adult you're not as like free-spirited and fun and innocent, and sometimes it's kind of nice just to keep the innocence of whatever you loved back then as it is. So the next like sections of books that I'm going to be talking about are going to be mostly adult, and then I'll obviously go back to children's and YA. But the reason I found this book is because for Thanksgiving, obviously the whole family gets together and the cousins and the aunts and uncles would give each other gifts, and I think one of my older cousins asked for this book, which was The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown, and I saw it and I was intrigued, so I wanted to read it too, which is basically what got me into Dan Brown. I think I was in like early-ish high school when, or maybe middle school, I don't remember, when I found Dan Brown, but this was the first book that I ever read by him, which was his latest book at the time it came out, and I remember absolutely loving these books. These, if you don't know Dan Brown, he writes, they're kind of like historical mysteries. They talk a lot, yeah, historical mysteries, and they're just really, really fun. But this makes me like kind of want to reread it, because I remember like really liking this book. It's just so much fun, and you're just like going on this adventure with the main character. And then obviously after I read The Lost Symbol, I wanted to pick up other books by him, so I picked up his most famous book, which is The Da Vinci Code. And I think, so my favorite book was The Lost Symbol, then The Da Vinci Code, and then Angels and Demons, which I also read. I just remember like really not liking the ending of this book, but these are the 3 Dan Brown books that I read. I don't remember if I have read any others, but Dan Brown is just a really fun read, and I'm curious to know if you've ever read Dan Brown. I feel like a lot of people have, and I would just love to hear your thoughts on him. So the next book that I want to talk about is also an adult book, and that is The Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Ayul. And I think, to be honest, I was a little bit too young to read this book when I did. I was in high school, and this book is a very dense adult book, but it's really, really good. So I've always really been interested in human evolution, and this book is basically talking about this woman who is Homo sapien, so like an evolved human that looks like us, and she basically is raised in a Neanderthal tribe, so she's like obviously like different than everyone else. This is set during the Ice Age, and I really loved these books. It's so dense. I mean, look at that, so dense. And I just remember there'd be like pages and pages of her talking about like the foliage and the leaves and the trees, and I was like, oh my god. There actually is a love story element, which becomes a little bit more prevalent later on in the series. As you can see behind me, this is the second, third, and fourth book. I think there's more. I just think I was like kind of over it by that point just because they are so dense. I remember really, really loving the second book though. I read it really, really fast. But if you're interested in like, you know, human evolution or any of that, I mean, I would definitely recommend this book. I know I didn't really sell it well. I think I would have enjoyed this book a lot better if I was an adult reading it versus just being a teenager. So this is also another adult book that's actually set in Seattle, which is where I'm from. And I think I found this book because my freshman year English teacher recommended it to me for some reason. And it's called Broken for You by Stephanie Callows. I feel like I never really hear people talking about this book. I just wanted to mention it because, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of you do read adult books, and I do want to recommend some adult books here. But this book is basically about this woman who's very heartbroken because she went through a recent breakup with her boyfriend, and she moves into a house with an older woman in Seattle, and it just talks about their bond with each other. Again, I feel like it'd be interesting to read this book as an adult because I probably was a little bit too young to read this at the time. I was probably like 14, but just if you're looking for a new adult read, I would definitely check this one out. So sophomore year of high school, we had to pick a classic to do an assignment on, and I wanted to pick obviously a shorter classic, so I decided to pick up The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. This is a sci-fi classic, and it's basically a first contact with aliens. Obviously, this is a very, very well-known book, and I do remember struggling a little bit with it because I'm not really a sci-fi person, but I decided to, for my book report, to write a poem because that was like one of the options that you could pick. And I wrote this incredibly long poem about it. It's like the longest poem I've ever written, but the reason why this book is really important to me is because this book is what got me into poetry, which I know is really weird because this is obviously not a poetry book, but since I wrote my first poem based off of this book and all the themes in this book, I started writing poetry from sophomore year on, and I still do a little bit. So this weirdly is the book that I think about when I think about what got me into poetry. And then I actually have read some other H.G. Wells books since this book. I've read The Invisible Man, and then just within the past year or so I read, or no, actually at the beginning of this year I read The Time Machine, which is probably my favorite book written by him. So this book that I'm going to talk about doesn't really have like a huge impact on my life, but for some reason whenever I think about like my childhood bookshelf, this book always comes to mind as something that I want to reread for some reason. And it's called Anne Frank and Me by Cherry Bennett and Jeff Gottsfeld. But this book is basically about a girl who goes to an Anne Frank exhibit. All of a sudden there's like gunshots and there's like a lot of commotion. And then she's transported back in time to Nazi-occupied Germany, where she then has to go into hiding and then comes face to face with Anne Frank. And I don't know why, like, I think this book is just like a really interesting concept. I read this a long time ago, probably, I'm assuming like early high school. And yeah, I don't know why, I just like have been wanting to reread this, so maybe one day I'll actually end up picking it up again. So the next book is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. This book is basically about, it's a true story of Mitch Albom interviewing his college professor who was like a mentor and made a huge impact on his life. I found this book because my freshman year English teacher loved this book so much, and she just raved about it all the time. We had to read it for school. So I picked it up. It's incredibly insightful. I mean, this book is like really, really popular, but I wouldn't say it's as well known as like a self-help book. But for people that aren't into just like traditional self-help books, this is a really good way to get like a lot of insight, but also have a story behind it where you really learn about the relationship between Mitch Albom and Morrie Schwartz, who is his former college professor. And because I love this book so much, I ended up getting really into Mitch Albom books. So I also read For One More Day by him, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, and Have a Little Faith. So obviously Mitch Albom became like one of my favorite authors at the time, and I read so much by him. I kind of like grew out of a lot of these authors, so Mitch Albom is not someone I read anymore. Same with Dan Brown. But that's just like how it goes in life. Like you get really into some author or something, and then it kind of just like lives in that part of your life, and then you move on. But this book will always remind me of freshman year of high school. And again, this is also a book that I do want to reread at some point, just because it has been many years since I've read it. So I've been trying to like stray away from like the traditional kids books, just because like I know a lot of you probably like don't come to BookTube to find like a Dr. Seuss book. It's like not really probably what you're looking for. But I do want to mention like some kids books that did mean a lot to me. So when I was like in later elementary school, I was really interested in dinosaurs, and I also really loved prehistoric aquatic dinosaurs, which I know is like very specific, but for some reason like sea serpents and like basically sea monsters were so interesting to me. So I have this book called Giants of Land, Sea, and Air, past and present. So this is both like animals that are living now, or like animals that have been extinct. But this book is so crazy interesting to me. So basically what this book does is it shows you like this is a giant squid, which obviously giant squids are still alive today, and it shows you the relation to a human. So it has like an adult male and adult female, and how big the animal is compared to the human. And I love this book so much. I just think, I don't know, I've just always thought that like how incredible is it that these animals can be so much bigger than human beings. And my favorite animal of all time is the blue whale, and I don't even think I'm gonna be, so this is literally just the first half of the blue whale. The other half keeps going on other pages. It's the largest mammal that's ever lived, and I just find that so fascinating. And in like the Natural History Museum in New York, if you've ever been there, there's that like giant blue whale that goes off in the whale, it's called the whale room, which is a room that I'm like sick of because I used to work there all the time, but it was still really cool to see like a life-size blue whale like in person. I mean, look at these, like how, like these are dinosaurs that used to actually exist. Like this is a sea serpent. I mean, it's just so crazy. So yeah, I mean, maybe I should, this is like the first time I've opened this book in years, and maybe I should like relook at it, but I just think it's so cool. And yeah, this is us compared to a Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is obviously like a huge predator, but not even like the biggest dinosaur out there, but probably the most vicious. But anyway, yeah, this book meant a lot to me because I really loved science when I was little, and obviously this book has a lot of science and paleontology in it. So another book that made a huge impact on me, which I actually don't even think I've ever read before, but it's called Secrets of the Mummies. And this is just like one of those like kid books that like kind of just go over like ancient Egypt and mummies and all those things. I don't ever think I really read the text in the book. I actually might have been too young, because I remember having this on my bookshelf when I was really little, but I just remember being so obsessed. I was obsessed with ancient Egypt. I loved mummies and all that kind of stuff, and I still am interested in it today. And the reason why is just because of this one book that I've never even read, but I just loved, I'm actually not going to show you because some of the pictures are kind of like disturbing, but I just loved looking through this book. And I know this sounds like really deep, but I just thought it was so interesting when I was little. Like with mummies, it's obviously like a human being that is not alive anymore, and it like made me contemplate like, what does that mean to be a human and not have like a life in it? So I was like basically contemplating death in a way, which is like really sad. But this book just like opened me up to like this whole new world, and yeah, I really loved this book a lot, and this definitely made a huge impact on my childhood. So now I'll get into some YA books that meant a lot to me. And I was actually just reading the back of this book, and I didn't realize that it's actually set in New York City, which makes me kind of want to reread it. But it's Kind of a Funny Story by Ned Vizzini. I obviously just love this cover too. I think it's so beautiful. But this is basically about a boy who wants to harm himself and then is checked into a mental institution where he basically just meets all of these other people around him, and it talks about his experience being in a mental hospital and the people that he meets. And I forgot it was set in New York City, and yeah, I really do want to reread this book now. But the reason why I like this book so much is because, as you probably know, I'm really interested in mental health, and this book obviously touched a lot on mental health and just the pressures that you face as a teen. And I just remember really loving this book. And this is a book that I would recommend to not only young adult people, but also adults can read this book too and get a lot out of it as well. This book you've probably heard of, or if not, you definitely have heard of the author, and that is Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell. I loved this book so much. It's a YA book it's a love story between Eleanor and Park, as you can see on the cover. But I remember loving this book so much when I was younger, and it's actually interesting because I remember seeing on BookTube people were talking about how this book was like really problematic. I just feel like as a teenager I probably wasn't really able to see that, and I at the time thought this was a really cute love story. I later went on to read Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell, which I know is like a huge book on BookTube that everyone loves. I remember thinking it was okay, but this book is something that I really like, and probably will change my opinion about if I did end up rereading it, but I just remember really loving this book at the time I read it. So this next book I actually didn't read growing up. I read it like in college, I think, but it is a YA book, so I thought I might as well mention it, and it's Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. I don't remember a lot about it. I just remember it's about this girl who has like cancer or is like suffering from something, and Greg, I guess his name is, and his friend Earl would like visit her, and they created this friendship. And I just remember really liking this book because I felt like how the main character wrote, because it was written first person, it just sounded like the way I thought in my head, at least at the time I read it, which is when I was like a sophomore in college. But if you're looking for a YA book, I would definitely recommend this one as well. Like most people, I was required to read Shakespeare when I was in high school, so we read Romeo and Juliet, and I have the editions where it's basically like the original text and the like English that would make sense to people today. And I was not the sort of person that just read the regular English. I made sure to read both sides just because I wanted to really get into Shakespeare's writing. So yeah, we read Romeo and Juliet, we read Hamlet, and then we also read Othello, which I remember Othello being my favorite out of the three of these. Curious to know what books or what Shakespeare books you're required to read in high school. I feel like every high school requires Shakespeare, but the Shakespeare books that are actually chosen are different depending on the high school you went to. So share with me below the ones that you were required, but yeah, I remember Othello being my favorite. I could probably go on all day with all the books that I read when I was little, but I just want to end it here. I actually do want to share with you some honorable mentions though that I don't have currently on my bookshelves, because obviously through the years we gave a lot of my books away. So I obviously read the entire Harry Potter series, which I read I think in 7th grade. It was at the point where the last Harry Potter book was just coming out, so I wanted to make sure I read all of them, so I was ready. I feel like I'm the only person who read Harry Potter and enjoyed my experience, but then kind of like put them down and like moved on. I feel like people are either like you're obsessed with Harry Potter or you've never read them before, and I read them but I have never really been that obsessed with them. So yeah, the Harry Potter series I did really like. And then obviously the Click series, which I had almost the entire series. I feel like this was the book series that you read in middle school, but yeah, I remember really loving those. And then my favorite series that I actually read was the Private series, which is kind of like the Click, but it's a lot darker. And I remember actually recently-ish I reread on audiobook the first book in the series, and it's crazy like how problematic that book is, and I didn't even realize that as a teenager, because the main character, she like goes through abuse by like the guy she's dating, and there's just like no reconciliation with it, and she just accepts it. And I feel like as an adult reading that, I'm like, wow, I cannot believe this was in a teen book that I read as a kid and I had no idea. But anyway, love the Private series. And then it also had a spin-off series on one of the main characters, which I also really liked. And then I also wanted to mention Lewis Lowry, who is an amazing author, and I've just been rereading so many of her books. So I read The Giver again, and then I read the entire quartet. The Giver actually wasn't one of my favorite books when I was young, even though I did read it when I was little. But Number the Stars was my favorite book in 3rd grade, and I actually reread that book on audio, and it's still so amazing. And it's just about this girl whose best friend is Jewish, and it's during World War II. And yeah, love that book so much. And if you're looking for a really great audiobook that's a children's audiobook, I highly recommend Number the Stars. I just wanted to give those books shout outs because those books also meant a lot to me, even though I don't currently have them on my shelves. This has been such like a personal video for me, and I could just talk all day about all the books that meant a lot to me growing up. I would love to hear if you've read, I'm sure you've read some of the books that I've read, especially like the Shakespeare books and all of that, but please let me know what your favorite books were when you were growing up and were a kid, or some of the your favorite books that you read when you were in high school or just school in general, because a lot of the books that I read today or read in the past were really influenced by the books or the things that I was learning in school. So I would love to hear down below in the comments, but thank you so much for getting all the way to the end of this video. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in my next one.